Recently, there's been a trend amongst some NBA fans to downplay the impact older generations have had on the game of basketball. Whether it's referring to former pro players as plumbers or consistently harping about how some players wouldn't survive in today's game, it seems that fans are ignoring one crucial piece to the puzzle. And that is that today's players are largely just building and adding on to the groundwork laid out by former generations. Or, in other words, you don't have Kobe without having Michael Jordan first. Now, obviously, Michael's impact over the game is pretty apparent to almost every fan, but what about the other guys? The players that don't get the recognition they deserve for shaping not only how some modern players play, but how entire teams format their rosters. As, after all, there are plenty of players that fit that description. So in this video, I'm going to go over just a few players and give them their flowers for helping shape the game into the highlight machine that the modern NBA currently is. Starting off this list, we have Mark Price. Mark was an undersized guard at 6 feet, and in more ways than one was truly Steph Curry before Steph Curry. Except with knee issues instead of ankle issues. Mark spent his entire 12-year career with the Cleveland Cavaliers, and if it wasn't for those knee injuries, he most likely would have stayed there for even longer. But during his prime, he was the floor general for that Cavs squad that had a few run-ins with Michael Jordan during the playoffs. Although more often than not, they were usually just a footnote on the Bulls' way to another championship. Despite that though, Mark was an elite player, a 4-time All-Star, back-to-back winner of the three-point contest, doing so while helping to lead that Cavs team to quite a few 50-win seasons. And to be a 6-foot-tall guard and lead a team to 50 wins during the 90s should make Mark Price more of a household name just off the strength of that alone. So let's talk about his game and how his contributions to the NBA still echo on decades later. Obviously, a career 50-40-90 player, Mark was one of the league's greatest shooters during his time and still holds up as one of only 10 players to ever accomplish that for one single season, let alone for his entire career. But as I mentioned, Steph Curry shows flashes of Mark Price in more than just their shooting, as Mark was an absolute magician working off screens and truly a pioneer for this aspect of the sport. And watching how the Warriors run their offense, it's pretty clear that Steph's picked up a lot of influence from Mark, and with Steph changing how the entire league thought about playing, well, there's a pretty direct line about how Price has been able to have influence over the entire modern game. But if you want to be even more direct, he's actually worked with multiple NBA teams as a shooting coach, so there is that as well. Next up, we have David Thompson. David was one of the most explosive and electrifying players in basketball history, a high-flying guard whose game helped bridge the gap between the ABA's flair and the NBA's gradual shift toward adopting some of those high-flying aspects. He was a player who redefined what it meant to be a guard living above the rim. And for a brief but brilliant period during the late 70s, he was one of the most dominant forces in the entire sport. During his rookie season, he started off his career with the Denver Nuggets in the ABA, that would ultimately be the Nuggets' last season in the NBA, as the merger would happen immediately following David's rookie season. And it didn't take long for Thompson to get adjusted to NBA life, averaging 27.3 in just his second year in the newly merged league, while finishing third in MVP voting behind Bill Walton and George Gervin. This also being the same year where he would drop 73 points in a game, tying him with Luka Doncic and Wilt Chamberlain for the 4th most amount of points scored in a game. But second most if we're talking about games where we actually have footage from. But similarly to Mark Price, his career was cut short due to injuries, and a little bit of off-court issues as well. And this is probably why David isn't more of a household name. But he's definitely not a name forgotten by other great players, more specifically, Michael Jordan. Years back, MJ mentioned in a Slam interview that he hadn't ever actually watched an NBA game before joining the league. As a kid, he'd only ever watched baseball, NASCAR, and college basketball, going on to say, quote, "It's a lot easier, you don't have to pattern your game behind someone because you've never paid attention to it, other than David Thompson or someone like that." And mind you, this interview was in '97, 13 years after David Thompson's last season and over 20 years since he was the skywalking player that Jordan would have been watching at UNC. So the fact that this was the first player to come to mind shows that Thompson might be the player that Jordan was first influenced by. Further proven by MJ personally asking him to be the one who would present Michael into the Hall of Fame. The influence left by David Thompson can still be seen today in players like Ja Morant and Zach LaVine. The next player we got to talk about is Detlef Schrempf. Detlef was actually the first ever European to be named as an All-Star in the NBA. There are many things that make Detlef an influential player, as many modern European NBA players themselves would likely tell you. Whether you want to talk about his IQ or his quite smooth touch while dishing out the ball, Detlef quietly had a little bit of everything in his game offensively. However, for the sake of this video, it's his shooting ability that makes him a standout, specifically his three-point shooting. For people aware of Detlef, this might sound a little odd considering that for the first 11 years of his career, he just barely averages more than half attempt a game, but once he got to Seattle in the later half of his career, they unlocked that little piece of his game. In his first year with the team, he averaged his patent half attempt a game, but in the second year, the Supersonics started to stretch the floor out more and his attempts went up to almost 2.5 a game. And he was knocking down 51% of them. This trend continued on for a few years, breathing new life into the later stages of Detlef's career. And at that same time, a fellow German was preparing himself for the journey over to the NBA, and naturally Dirk Nowitzki was a massive Detlef fan, mentioning on multiple occasions how big of an influence he's had over his career, a career that saw him essentially create the term stretch four. So in a league that's now filled with European superstars and stretch bigs, let's not forget about one of the first to do it. And finally, we have Shawn Marion. During those 7 seconds or less years in Phoenix, it was often Steve Nash or Amiri Stoudemire that were getting the lion's share of the praise. But none of what they were able to accomplish would have been possible without Shawn Marion's relentless defense, routinely being amongst the highest in the league for PER, win shares, and defensive rating. And on top of his prominence on defense, he was still a player that would contribute offensively as well. Although his jump shot was slightly broken, he was still a reliable scorer, averaging 19 or more for a 5-year stretch. And it's definitely not a stretch to say that Shawn Marion is the prototype for players that we see today like OG Anunoby and Draymond Green. Athletic players who can lock down 1 to 5 while also being a contributor on the offensive end. Increasingly, these 6'7" wings that show athleticism are the most common player that teams are looking for when it comes to the draft. And Shawn's influence over that is definitely felt when it comes to that decision. These are just a few players. There's others that definitely deserve a nod, like Arvydas Sabonis, but at this point I feel like he's been called underrated so often that he's probably just accurately rated now. But obviously his influence is felt when talking about Nikola Jokic and his son Domantas Sabonis, especially when looking at how both Sabonises were able to utilize the dribble handoff. But for now, that's it for this list. If there's any other player you can think of, let us know in the comments and we'll see you back here next week for the next upload.